Daenerys Targaryen stood on the raised platform in the audience chamber of the Great Pyramid of Meereen, shoulders squared and chin held high. The pungent heat of Slaver's Bay pressed heavily against every surface of her skin. But if she felt discomfort, she refused to show it. Her silver-blonde hair was braided meticulously behind her head, and in the torchlight, her violet eyes gleamed with restrained curiosity. She had expected many supplicants, envoys, and would-be allies to come forth in these days, yet even she had not entirely foreseen this. Theon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, his sister Yara standing stiffly at his side, offering their fealty and something more. Tyrion Lannister, ever watchful, assessed Theon with a critical eye from his position near the queen. The dwarf's hand curled around a goblet of wine, a mark of nervous habit more than anything else. Varys lingered behind him, face inscrutable. Grey Worm stood like a statue near the entrance, ready to protect his queen at a moment's notice, and Missandei hovered just a step behind Daenerys, poised to interpret if needed. In the wake of Daenerys's successful containment of the Sons of the Harpy and her nascent governance of Meereen, she had looked beyond the narrow sea once again. It was time to plan her invasion of Westeros in earnest. She had dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, and she had armies. The Unsullied, the Khalasar. But she needed ships. Victarion Greyjoy's ill-fated attempts to make contact, Euron Greyjoy's rumored gambits. None of these had solidified. Then, almost out of nowhere, Theon and Yara Greyjoy had arrived at her door in Meereen. In hushed, sober tones, Yara had introduced herself and stated their purpose. The Iron Fleet awaited them, albeit battered and less numerous than it had once been. Yara, poised as she was, had not mentioned marriage or alliances stronger than a mutual agreement to support Daenerys's claim in exchange for the Iron Islands' autonomy. But Theon, with shadows beneath his eyes and a strangely humble bearing, had done something unexpected. He had, with a trembling voice, offered himself as a potential consort to secure the alliance of the Ironborn under his rightful rule. At the moment of his offer, Daenerys's composure almost cracked. She was used to suitors, Daario Naharis was one, and before him had been others, whether they expressed their admiration openly or not. But Theon Greyjoy's offer was different. It was a purely political act. She saw the guilt in his eyes, the roiling anguish of a man haunted by past deeds. Tyrion, too, must have sensed it because he said nothing in that instant. Yara's fists had been clenched at her sides. The suggestion might not have been hers, or she had only grudgingly agreed. Days passed. Daenerys held private audiences with Theon, often with Tyrion present, though sometimes she preferred to speak to her potential ally alone, to weigh the measure of him. She found that Theon, though broken in many ways, was sincere in his quest for redemption. The marriage was not some grasp for power, not purely. He recognized he was no longer the man he had been when he betrayed the Starks. Something within him had shifted. If Yara alone had come with a fleet, Daenerys might have accepted Yara's fealty with gratitude and kept her distance. But Theon's presence changed the dynamic. An official union between the Ironborn and House Targaryen was bold and potentially dangerous, but it could also provide a stable path for her claim. Tyrion played the role of devil's advocate, pointing out that Theon had a spotted past, that some lords in Westeros would never trust him. He also emphasized that marriage was not to be entered lightly. This was not a mere footnote in the negotiation of alliances. But after listening to Theon's halting confessions, his genuine remorse, after measuring his will against the formidable burdens he carried, Daenerys began to see a different angle. If she married Theon Greyjoy, she would have control or, at the very least, partnership in the Iron Islands. The Iron Fleet, or what remained of it, would sail under the Targaryen banner. No king or queen could stand alone, not even one with dragons. The final impetus for her decision came when she thought of her own father, the Mad King, and how the history of Westeros had judged him. House Targaryen was still overshadowed by those brutal stories. Theon, in his own smaller measure, bore the weight of a name associated with treachery. He had betrayed the Starks. If Daenerys could find redemption and a new future for her house, perhaps Theon could do the same for the Iron Islands. Forging that bond might signal to the rest of Westeros that she was not a queen who would cast aside the broken or the fallen. She would attempt to unite, and so Daenerys Targaryen agreed. The betrothal was announced in Meereen's main square, where the people gathered, freedmen and free women, curious travelers, emissaries from lesser cities. The air smelled of spiced fish and roasted goat, and the Great Pyramid's banners flapped in the sea breeze. A hush fell over the crowd as Daenerys stepped forward, flanked by her advisors. Theon, looking lean, haunted, but somehow determined, wore simple gray and black leathers, nothing too ostentatious. He stood a step behind Yara, who seemed ready to intervene if her brother faltered. Daenerys spoke with a regal clarity, addressing her people and the visitors who clamored in the courtyard. She told them that House Targaryen was forging a pact with House Greyjoy, that the Iron Fleet would lend its sails and steel to the Breaker of Chains, the Mother of Dragons, and in return, there would be a marriage bond uniting the two houses. The freed people of Meereen, who understood that Daenerys was on the verge of leaving their city for new destinies, did not entirely grasp the significance of a marriage in Westeros, but they cheered for their queen nonetheless. Some murmured that Dario Naharis, who had once stood so close to Daenerys, was nowhere to be seen. Others asked if Theon Greyjoy was the master of the great ships anchored outside the city. Theon himself merely bowed his head, the corners of his mouth pulled tight with conflicting emotions. That night, Daenerys held a private feast in the Great Pyramid for her closest advisors and her new allies. It was a muted affair, not the wild revel some might have expected. Theon drank sparingly, glancing across the table at his sister from time to time, as if to gather courage from her presence. He occasionally met Daenerys's gaze. She did not smile at him. She was not one to offer easy warmth to a man she barely knew, but there was a certain measured kindness in her eyes, as though she was inviting him to stand on equal ground. It was Tyrion who broke the tension with a raised cup. His voice, somewhat slurred by the wine, rang out in the high-ceilinged hall. He proposed a toast to new beginnings. He spoke of old grudges cast aside and the potential to reshape the Seven Kingdoms for the better, once Daenerys took the Iron Throne. He ended with a flourish, praising the unsullied courage of the Ironborn, which earned a half-snort of amusement from Yara. But Theon raised his goblet all the same, and Daenerys lifted hers. The cups clinked in a moment that, if not exactly joyous, was at least steeped in hope. In the days leading up to the wedding, a hush seemed to settle over Meereen. There were no grand bazaars or throngs of curious onlookers, as might have been in King's Landing or Old Volantis. The city was still recovering from the recent violence of the Sons of the Harpy, and Daenerys had made sure that her people's needs came first. She had no desire for a lavish spectacle. Rather, she wanted a measured ceremony that signified the seriousness of her intentions to Westeros, and specifically to the Ironborn. The wedding itself took place at dusk, on a broad terrace of the Great Pyramid. Braziers burned low, and the flicker of torches caught in Theon's hair, turning it to a shade reminiscent of molten copper. Daenerys wore white and gold, her silver hair braided in loops that revealed her neck and shoulders. She stood with regal poise before a table bearing the banners of House Targaryen, a red three-headed dragon on black, and House Greyjoy, a golden kraken on black. The wind from the bay whipped at the corners of these banners, making them snap and tug. Attendants, several freedmen who had become loyal servants to Daenerys, brought forth simple ceremonial items: a cup of salt water to symbolize the Ironborn's domain over the sea, a small brazier of coals to symbolize the fire of House Targaryen. Varys watched with a slight tilt of his head, perhaps wondering how such disparate elements would fuse together in a wedding vow. Tyrion, dressed in finery for once, kept a careful eye on proceedings. Grey Worm and Missandei stood near Daenerys, silent witnesses, and Yara was as close to Theon's side as she could be without overshadowing him. No Septon presided. The faith of the Seven was far from Slaver's Bay, and Daenerys had not entrusted the officiation to any red priests of R'hllor either. Instead, she invoked the old ways of Valyria in a brief, solemn vow she had prepared. Theon, for his part, poured a small measure of the salt water over a stone that symbolized the Iron Islands, a tradition gleaned from his father's ancient ways. These two rites formed a curious amalgamation of Targaryen and Greyjoy heritage. Theon's voice, though quiet, did not quaver as he repeated the vow Daenerys had requested of him, promising loyalty in war and in peace. When the ceremony concluded with Daenerys stepping forward to link her arm in Theon's, there was no wild cheering. The small assembly of watchers merely bowed their heads in deference. Theon's face was pale, but his expression was set with determination, as if he recognized the enormity of what he had just committed to. Daenerys looked at him, silently studying this man who had become her husband by political necessity, and she gave a single, slow nod. That night, behind the closed doors of a chamber draped with Targaryen insignia, they spoke quietly. Daenerys made no grand demands. She told Theon he could sleep on a couch at the opposite end if he wished. There was no expectation they would consummate anything immediately. He was visibly grateful for that reprieve, relief crossing his face. She saw the scars on him, physical and emotional. She knew from what she had gleaned of his time under Ramsay Bolton that he had been brutalized into near submission, and she felt an unexpected pang of empathy. She was, in her own way, shaped by trauma, by the memory of a brother who had sold her as a bride, by the uncertain years of her youth in exile, by the fear that she could lose everything at any moment. They spoke of small matters first: the sense of salt in the air around Pike, the dryness of the Meereen climate, the swirl of the Dothraki language outside the pyramid. Then, haltingly, they inched into deeper topics. Theon confessed he wasn't sure he deserved redemption. Daenerys told him redemption was earned over time, not in a single day. By the hour grew late, Theon retired to a small couch, and Daenerys gazed out a window at the city's lights, flickering reflections on the dark waters of Slaver's Bay. Within a week, the Targaryen banners and the newly pledged Iron Fleet were preparing to depart Meereen. Daenerys had left the city under the governance of Daario Naharis and a council that Tyrion had helped organize, though Tyrion himself would accompany her, as would Varys, Missandei, and Grey Worm. The Dothraki, eager to cross the sea, marveled at the ships. Horses were loaded onto great vessels, while unsullied soldiers oversaw the loading of rations and supplies. The three dragons wheeled overhead, causing the more skittish members of the iron-born crews to duck reflexively as the leathery wings beat across the sky. In the harbor, one of the largest war galleys had been prepared for Daenerys. Its hull was reinforced, and upon its sail was painted the emblem of House Targaryen superimposed with the kraken of House Greyjoy, a combined sigil hammered out at Daenerys's request. She wanted the Seven Kingdoms to see the unity of dragon and kraken the moment their sails came into view. Theon stood with Daenerys on the deck, Yara at his side as they surveyed the controlled chaos of departure. Theon gave crisp orders to the ironborn sailors, who rushed to secure lines and rigging. He no longer barked commands with arrogance. His voice was tempered by caution and the need to prove himself worthy of the alliance he had brokered. Daenerys observed him quietly and occasionally turned to Missandei to confirm the schedule. When the fleet finally set sail, Slaver's Bay receding into the distance, Daenerys watched the city that had become her proving ground fade on the horizon. Theon, feeling her gaze, came to stand beside her. The wind whipped at both their hair. Daenerys asked if he would miss the warmth of the east, and Theon half smiled, replying that warmth was a rare thing for an ironborn to grow accustomed to. He tried to muster a wry humor, though his eyes still held that haunted cast. The voyage across the narrow sea was mercifully smooth. Theon and Yara worked together to maneuver the Iron Fleet, ensuring that the Dothraki ships, the unsullied transports, and the Targaryen flagship maintained formation. Daenerys spent her time in strategy meetings with Tyrion, discussing how best to make landfall in Westeros. Their first target would likely be Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen. If Stannis Baratheon or any other pretenders were gone, it might be unoccupied or lightly garrisoned. That would be an ideal foothold from which to launch further campaigns. During these long days at sea, Daenerys and Theon spent more private hours together learning how to be allies and, at least in name, spouses. They spoke of the houses of Westeros, of the lords and ladies Theon knew, the ones he had met as a hostage in Winterfell or while traveling. He spoke of Robb Stark with guilt and sorrow, He mentioned Sansa Stark, who he had heard had escaped from the Lannisters, and then from Ramsay Bolton. Daenerys listened intently, gleaning all the knowledge she could of the land she meant to conquer. Sometimes, Daenerys offered a small piece of her own history. She told Theon of her brother Viserys, of his cruelty, and how his thirst for the crown had nearly destroyed them both before he met his end at Khal Drogo's hands. She spoke of her dragons, how they had hatched from stone and fire. She told him that all Targaryens walk hand in hand with magic and danger. Theon shuddered at the mention of magic, remembering the horrors he had witnessed in his life, from Melisandre's shadow to the monstrous illusions conjured by Ramsay Bolton's cruelty. Their conversations were stilted at times, yet there was a sense of fragile respect building between them. Daenerys did not press Theon for intimacy. She understood that the wedding vow was in many ways a diplomatic statement, and Theon, for his part, found himself wanting to at least be of use, to prove that he was not entirely beyond redemption. When they sat at council with Tyrion, Yara, Grey Worm, and Missandei, Theon occasionally contributed an insight about the coastline of the Vale or the precarious alliances of the Reach. One evening, as the fleet neared the coast of Dorne, word came from the lookouts. A small sail was sighted drifting aimlessly, battered by storms. It bore no sigil that any recognized. Daenerys ordered that the vessel be brought alongside to see if there were survivors. A handful of Ironborn boarded the wreck, returning with a near-starved man and a girl who clung to him. They were from Lys, or so they claimed, refugees fleeing the chaos in Essos, but they had been lost at sea. Daenerys had them given food and water, and Theon quietly ordered that they be watched closely, for fear of spies or sabotage. Yet it turned out they were only what they seemed, desperate souls seeking safety. Daenerys, moved by their plight, offered them transport to Dorne if that was their wish. The incident weighed on Theon's mind. He had once turned his back on the desperate, had once spurned pleas for mercy. That night, he found Daenerys on the stern of the ship, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. He told her it was good what she had done, sparing them. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful, and said that she was not in the business of cruelty. Theon nodded, then said something that surprised even himself. He wanted to learn from her. He wanted to see how she would rule, how she would conquer, and yet show mercy. He wanted to become something more than a craven traitor. Daenerys did not smile, but she inclined her head and said softly that perhaps they were each trying to outgrow the shadows of their fathers. By the time they made landfall at Dragonstone, a gray pall hung over the sky, and the sea churned with a somber hiss against the black rock of the island's coast. The castle loomed above them, a fortress carved in the shape of dragons long ago, spires and gargoyles resembling scaled beasts. Tyrion led a small advance party to confirm that the fortress was abandoned or lightly manned. They found no significant resistance, only a paltry handful of soldiers and servants who had managed to hold on after Stannis' departure. These men were so few and so demoralized that they offered no fight when Daenerys' forces arrived. They surrendered, swore fealty, or fled. Dragonstone belonged to House Targaryen once more. Daenerys stood in the great hall, her footsteps echoing off the walls carved with dragons, flames, and Valyrian glyphs. The hall was cold, drafty even in summer. She felt a strange sense of belonging. Her ancestors had once walked these very floors. It was a homecoming of sorts, though it was not the Red Keep of King's Landing, nor the seat of the Iron Throne. But it was a foothold in Westeros, a place from which to begin in earnest. Theon set to work overseeing the anchorage of the Iron Fleet in the harbor. His men scouted the rocky coastline, marking places that might be vulnerable if Euron Greyjoy or any other hostile naval force attempted to challenge them. Yara proved invaluable in these efforts, her keen tactical mind noticing hidden coves and natural barricades. Meanwhile, Daenerys summoned a war council. They gathered in Dragonstone's map room, around the massive table that displayed a relief of Westeros in intricate detail. Daenerys placed her hands on the carved wood, her brow furrowed. She looked at Theon and Yara. She looked at Tyrion, Grey Worm, Missandei. She told them that their first move must be calculated. They did not want to come in as conquerors raining fire indiscriminately. She wished to win the support of the great houses or, if needed, defeat them swiftly with minimal bloodshed. Tyrion advised that they seek alliances in the Reach, perhaps with the Tyrells, who likely loathed the Lannisters by now. He also suggested sending emissaries to Dorne, given Illyria Sand's vendetta against House Lannister. Theon, for his part, argued that they should also keep an eye on the north. He had heard rumors of Jon Snow, declared king in the north, and Sansa Stark, now Lady of Winterfell. The Starks were rising once more. At the mention of the Starks, Theon's voice caught. He remembered all too well what he had done to Winterfell, the betrayal that had sparked the chain of events leading to Robb's downfall. He wanted to make amends. But how? Daenerys noticed the tremor in his tone and said they would deal with the north in time. First, they needed to consolidate the south. She also set a priority on controlling the seas around Dragonstone. Euron Greyjoy was a threat. If word reached him of Theon's new alliance, he might attempt to strike swiftly. The Ironborn were famed for their reaving. Daenerys told Theon and Yara to be vigilant, for she did not intend to lose the advantage of the Iron Fleet. Over the next weeks, Dragonstone was transformed from a near-empty fortress into a bustling seat of power. The Unsullied patrolled the walls. Dothraki riders set up a small makeshift camp on the beaches, though many of them grumbled about the constant dampness and the salt that caked everything. Ships arrived bearing supplies from Essos, a vital lifeline. Ravens were sent out to major lords and ladies. Daenerys composed letters inviting them to treat with her, to discuss alliances or at least neutrality. If they refused, they would face the wrath of dragons. During this time, Theon often roamed the castle's corridors, silently taking in the architecture, the echoes of footsteps in hallways that might once have known Targaryen kings and princes. Daenerys, too, wandered at times, exploring corners of Dragonstone that might hold old secrets. Sometimes she found Theon in a shadowed alcove, gazing out at the sea. They would exchange a few quiet words, acknowledging each other's presence. Gradually, they learned small details about one another. Theon discovered Daenerys' habit of rising before dawn to check on her dragons, who nested in a lower courtyard specially prepared for them. Daenerys learned that Theon woke from nightmares and could not stand the sudden clinking of chains or heavy footsteps behind him. One evening, she tried to speak words of comfort, telling him that no man was beyond redemption. He swallowed hard and said that he wanted to believe her. Meanwhile, Tyrion conferred with Varys. Spies whispered that King's Landing was unsettled. The Lannisters, under Queen Cersei, were clinging to power, but they faced enemies on all sides. The Tyrells and the Dornish were on the brink of alliance with Daenerys. If Daenerys moved her forces strategically, King's Landing could be squeezed into submission, especially if the city's population turned on Cersei. However, caution was still paramount. The dragons were mighty, but they were not unstoppable, and Daenerys would not risk them in a rash assault that could lead to hundreds of thousands of innocent deaths. News from the north eventually reached Dragonstone. The Night King and the White Walkers were a growing threat, and winter had descended in earnest. Theon pressed the matter in council. The dead marched, the rumors said. The wall might not hold. Tyrion was skeptical of tales that sounded like myths, but Theon insisted he had seen enough horrors to believe it was possible. Daenerys listened with mounting concern. She, too, had heard rumors, from the Red Priestess Kinvara and from others who claimed a prophecy of ice and fire. She was the fire. What if the ice was something more than just House Stark? Time pressed on. Daenerys decided she needed to meet with Jon Snow, if the man truly was king in the north. Even if the White Walkers were an exaggeration, having an alliance with the north could only benefit her. Tyrion drafted a letter, inviting Jon Snow to Dragonstone. She signed it, describing herself by her many titles. Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, first of her name, the Unburnt, Queen of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Breaker of Chains, Mother of Dragons, and acknowledging her alliance with Theon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands by right of name and lineage, consort to the Queen. The notion of being titled consort made Theon uneasy. It was still strange to him. Yara teased him now and then, calling him Queen's husband with a smirk. He tried to brush it off, focusing on his duties. He oversaw patrols of the coastline, made sure the ships were well supplied, and reported to Daenerys regularly. She had tasked him with ensuring that Euron could not sneak up on them. The first clash with Euron Greyjoy's forces came sooner than expected. While patrolling the waters south of Dragonstone, a handful of Theon's scouts encountered a small squadron of Ironborn loyal to Euron. The skirmish was brief and bloody, with Theon's men ultimately outnumbered. The survivors limped back to Dragonstone, warning that Euron's main fleet might be prowling the waters. Daenerys immediately called a war council. She wanted to end the threat of Euron Greyjoy before he could do serious damage to her blockade or her alliances. Yara proposed a bold plan. Strike Euron's fleet head-on with the combined might of the Iron Fleet loyal to Theon and the dragons overhead. But Tyrion counseled caution, reminding everyone that the seas around Westeros could be tricky, the storms unpredictable. Theon, torn between wanting to prove himself and the memory of near capture, supported his sister's plan. He assured Daenerys that if the dragons provided air support, they could rout Euron. Daenerys, measuring the urgency, gave the order. Theon and Yara led a significant portion of the Iron Fleet out to sea. Daenerys would follow shortly on the back of Drogon, with Rhaegal and Viserion in tow, to ensure that if Euron attempted an ambush, he would find himself on the receiving end of dragonfire. Theon was tense, remembering how Euron had carved a bloody path through their people, proclaiming himself king of the Iron Islands. They met Euron's fleet in the Stormlands, near Shipbreaker Bay. Rain battered the decks, and lightning flashed across the sky. Euron's ships were more numerous than anticipated. He had pressed many smaller raiding vessels into service, forming a ragged blockade. As Theon and Yara's ships approached, the battered seas churned with a fury. Theon tried to keep focus on commanding his men, shouting over the howling wind. The clash began in earnest with ballista bolts whistling through the air, grappling hooks thrown across decks. Ironborn boarded each other's ships, axes and swords flashing in the lightning's glow. Theon found himself face to face with a knot of Euron's sailors. They recognized him, hissing out curses of turncloak and traitor. Theon fought them off with the desperation of a man who knew there was no going back. An axe nearly cleaved his arm, but he parried, took a glancing blow to the shoulder, and kicked the assailant overboard. The stench of salt and blood mingled with the shriek of the wind. Suddenly, above the roar of thunder, a new sound tore through the night, the piercing screech of dragons. Drogon swooped low, spewing a jet of orange flame that lit up the waves in an eerie glow. Euron's men cried out in terror as sails caught fire, and timbers cracked under the heat. Theon spared a glance skyward and saw Daenerys perched on Drogon's back, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, yet her gaze fierce. Rhaegal and Viserion circled overhead, unleashing smaller torrents of flame. Amid the chaos, Theon spotted Euron's flagship. Its mast towered over the rest, draped with a kraken sigil. Yara was already making for it, her ship maneuvering closer. Theon realized Yara intended to confront Euron personally. In that moment, with fires raging across the waters, Theon ordered his helmsmen to steer them into the fray. They rammed a smaller vessel aside, boards splintering, before lashing themselves to Euron's ship. Boarding was a harrowing ordeal, but Theon managed to cross the rocking planks. Euron appeared at the quarterdeck, laughing maniacally in the face of the storm, lightning gleaming off his wet leathers. He boasted that he had the blessing of the drowned god, that no dragon could match the fury of the sea. Yara attacked him from the side, but he knocked her aside with a powerful blow, hooking a hand around her hair. Theon, panting, forced himself forward, sword in hand. Fear threatened to paralyze him. He saw flashes of Ramsay, of the pain inflicted on him, but he pushed through the terror. He rushed Euron, fainting low. Euron released Yara to defend himself, steel meeting steel. Sparks flew. Euron sneered, calling Theon a coward, a broken thing. Theon's arms shook with every strike. But overhead, the dragons roared, and Euron's men cowered as the flames spread across the deck. The precarious footing was slick with rain and blood. Yara scrambled to her feet, aiming a slash at Euron's back. He whirled, blocking her just in time. Theon seized the opening and drove his sword at Euron's side. The blow landed with a sickening thud. Euron's laughter cut off in a choked gasp. Euron stumbled back, clutching his side, blood pooling between his fingers. He glared at Theon and Yara with a crazed intensity, as if refusing to believe he could be bested. A laugh, quieter now, bubbled up from his throat. He spat a mouthful of blood, muttered some incoherent curse. He tried to lift his axe, but Yara tore the weapon from his grip and shoved him against the burning mast. Theon, trembling, had to force himself to stand tall. Euron was dying, but even in his last moments, his eyes gleamed with malice. He coughed out something about the storm god avenging him, and then he sank to his knees, breath rattling, until he slumped over. With Euron's death, his crew's morale collapsed entirely. Some threw down their weapons, others tried to flee, only to be intercepted by Daenerys' dragons or the rest of Theon's fleet. Soon, the sea around them glowed with the embers of burning ships. Theon helped Yara back onto their own vessel, and they cut the lines, drifting away from the half-sunken flagship. Daenerys circled overhead, ensuring no more traps waited. When the storm finally calmed, morning light revealed the wreckage of Euron's fleet scattered across the bay. Surviving Ironborn loyal to Theon and Yara worked tirelessly to salvage what they could. Daenerys landed on Theon's ship, Drogon's claws scraping the deck, and dismounted. She looked at Theon, the blood on his clothes, the torn expression on his face, and she commended him for his courage. Then she said that this victory would echo across Westeros. The Mother of Dragons and the Lord of the Iron Islands stood united, and they had crushed a would-be usurper at sea. In the aftermath, Theon stood alone by the railing, staring at the water. He could not stop shaking. The adrenaline had turned to shock. Yara approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. She told him that Euron was dead, that they had reclaimed their honor for their house. She even ventured a rough attempt at comfort, saying that Balon, their father, would have been proud to see Theon standing strong again. Theon stared at her, tears mixing with rain on his face, and whispered that he only felt relief that it was over. When they returned to Dragonstone, Daenerys addressed the assembled forces in the courtyard. She praised Theon and Yara for their valor, promised that the Iron Fleet would maintain its place of honor by her side. She spoke of forging a new order in Westeros, where old fears and grudges might be put aside. Theon stood near her, silent and worn, but with a steady kind of resolve in his posture. Over the following days, ravens carried the news of Euron Greyjoy's defeat to all corners of Westeros. Word also spread of the alliance between House Targaryen and House Greyjoy, sealed by marriage. Some mocked the union as an odd mismatch, but others took it as a sign that Daenerys was not to be trifled with. If she could unify the famously fractious Ironborn behind her banner, what else could she accomplish? Jon Snow's reply soon arrived. He was coming south to Parley. He would meet Daenerys at Dragonstone. Tyrion greeted this news with cautious optimism. He had known Jon from his time at Winterfell. He said that Jon was an honorable sort, if a bit brooding. Theon's stomach churned at the thought of facing any Stark again. Memories clawed at him. The charred remains of 2 boys, the occupation of Winterfell, his betrayal of Robb. Jon Snow had not been close to Theon in those days. He was a brother to Robb, but had mostly kept his own counsel. Yet Theon knew that in Jon's eyes, he would be the man who seized Winterfell, who pretended to execute Bran and Rickon. When Jon arrived by ship, accompanied by Davos Seaworth and a small retinue, Daenerys greeted him in the courtyard of Dragonstone. Theon stood at her side, though the guilt threatened to overwhelm him. He saw the way Jon's eyes flickered with surprise and anger the moment they landed on Theon. For an instant, Jon's hand twitched near the hilt of his sword, but Davos placed a cautionary hand on Jon's arm, and they continued forward. Daenerys, in her regal manner, welcomed them, repeating her many titles. Jon introduced himself simply as Jon Snow, King in the North, though Tyrion gently teased that he was sure more formal titles could be found if they wanted them. Jon did not smile. His gaze darted between Daenerys and Theon, and Daenerys could sense the tension. She guided them inside to the Great Hall so they could speak without an audience. Jon was there for one reason, he said, the threat of the White Walkers. The dead marched beyond the wall, and winter was upon them. He had come seeking help, not to bend the knee. Daenerys listened, her face impassive. She stated her claim to the Iron Throne and insisted that the North was part of the Seven Kingdoms. She demanded recognition. Jon, stiffening, explained again that he had no time for politics if the entire realm was about to face annihilation. Daenerys frowned but did not immediately dismiss his plea. She had her own experiences with the supernatural. She knew well that improbable things could happen in this world. It was Theon who, surprising everyone, spoke up in Jon's favor. He said he believed Jon. He had heard enough rumors, and he had seen the darkness that men could conjure. If these White Walkers were real, then ignoring the threat would be madness. Daenerys, Tyrion, and the others turned to look at Theon, a note of astonishment in their eyes. Even Jon was taken aback. Daenerys asked if Jon would pledge any sort of fealty to her cause in return for help. Jon pressed his lips together, refusing to kneel. But he acknowledged that if she would help him protect the North from the undead, then she would have his gratitude and perhaps the loyalty of his people if they survived. Davos weighed in, pointing out that these negotiations would be far more productive if they avoided old grudges. He cast a meaningful glance at Theon, who lowered his head. After some debate, Daenerys decided she would assist Jon in gathering dragonglass from Dragonstone's mines, a material rumored to be lethal to the White Walkers. In return, Jon would not openly oppose her claim. They struck a tentative accord. Tension remained thick in the air, but it was a start. That evening, Theon approached Jon alone, finding him near a brazier in one of the courtyards. Jon glared at him, jaw set. Theon swallowed, then told Jon he was sorry for what he had done to the Starks. He said he would not make excuses, but he wanted Jon to know that he regretted everything. Jon's eyes flickered with anger, and he said that forgiveness was not his to give, that Theon had betrayed the family that raised him. Theon did not dispute this. He only said that he was trying to atone, that he had sworn his loyalty to Daenerys because he believed in her cause, and now he would see if they could also save the North. Jon paused, then said quietly that Theon had at least saved Sansa from Ramsay Bolton. He acknowledged that act. Theon nodded, relief warring with sorrow. He knew he couldn't change the past. He could only move forward step by agonizing step. As days passed, Jon and his men began to mine the dragonglass beneath Dragonstone, aided by the Unsullied. Daenerys oversaw the efforts, occasionally flying Drogon over the beaches to strike awe into the hearts of the new arrivals. Tensions cooled slightly, and Daenerys found herself speaking more often with Jon about the war to come. Theon continued his duties, aware that Jon was watching him with a guarded caution. Yara, for her part, found the whole scenario tedious. She disliked the cold men of the North and spent her time drilling her sailors. Eventually, word reached Dragonstone that the Lannisters had grown emboldened. Cersei had formed alliances with the remnants of the Freys and possibly other discontented lords. Jaime Lannister had led a decisive strike against Highgarden, robbing House Tyrell of its wealth. Daenerys' plan to starve out King's Landing by capturing its food supplies was in jeopardy. Tyrell power in the Reach was crumbling. Daenerys, incensed, debated taking her dragons to torch the Lannister army. Tyrion warned her that unleashing dragons in open battle would risk turning the common folk against her, making her appear like the Mad King's daughter. Jon, from his vantage, understood that the Lannisters were a threat, but he reiterated that the army of the dead was a larger danger. The tension in the War Council rose to a new peak. In the midst of these disputes, Theon tried to offer a voice of reason. He pointed out that if they allowed the Lannisters to crush all resistance in the south, Daenerys would lose valuable allies, Dorne and what remained of the Reach. That, in turn, would weaken her ability to aid the North. Tyrion conceded the point, but insisted that a measured approach was essential. Yara advocated for a decisive strike on King's Landing itself, blockading the city from the sea, but Daenerys hesitated, still remembering the promise she had made, not to become a queen of ashes. Finally, they reached a compromise. Daenerys would lead a smaller force, including a single dragon, to ambush the Lannister caravan carrying gold from Highgarden. Theon and Yara's ships would raid supply lines along the coast to further harass Lannister movements. The rest of the forces would remain at Dragonstone, preparing for the possibility that the White Walkers might breach the wall. Jon would return to the north with the Dragonglass. Before Jon departed, Daenerys took him aside. She told him she was trusting that he would not turn the north against her, that he would remember she was not simply a foreign invader but someone who recognized the greater threat. Jon nodded gravely, promising to send ravens if the situation grew dire. He cast a look at Theon, who was standing back, and gave him a short, terse nod. Theon understood this was as close to a truce as they might come. True to the plan, Daenerys mounted Drogon for a lightning strike on the Lannister forces. Theon remained behind, organizing a coastal raid. As it turned out, Daenerys' surprise attack on the caravan was a brutal victory. Caught off guard, the Lannister army was overwhelmed by dragonfire. Jaime Lannister narrowly escaped with his life, jumping into a river to avoid Drogon's flames. The gold was lost to Daenerys' forces, though in the chaos, some caravans slipped away. Theon's raids also caused a stir. He led a few swift attacks on ships carrying supplies to Lannister-held ports. The raids were successful, capturing cargoes of grain and even some weapon shipments. However, the Ironborn loyal to Euron who had not been destroyed in the earlier battle still lurked, and Theon had to be cautious. Whenever a risk seemed too great, he withdrew rather than pressing his luck. Yara praised his judgment, remarking that once he might have charged blindly for glory. Now he was more thoughtful, if still burdened by the desire to prove himself. As the conflict in the south continued, ravens came from the north with grave news. The Night King had broken through Eastwatch by the sea. The wall had been breached by some fell magic, or perhaps by an undead dragon. Theon stood in the courtyard at Dragonstone, reading the message with dread. If the rumors were true, the Night King possessed a dragon of his own, undead and horrifying. He remembered the stories told around the War Council table and felt a chill creep through him that had nothing to do with the sea wind. Daenerys returned to Dragonstone victorious from her ambush, but with a sobering revelation. She had seen the devastation her dragon wrought upon soldiers and men who might have been forced to fight for Cersei. She had also met with the freed slaves and common folk who had flocked to her cause after the battle, and she realized just how precarious a direct war of fire and blood could be. Tyrion urged her to press the advantage. King's Landing was vulnerable, but the reports from the north were too dire to ignore. In an emergency gathering, Jon's raven was read aloud. He begged for aid. The dead were coming faster than anticipated. Winterfell was preparing defenses, but the entire north might be overrun without help. Daenerys, torn between her newfound momentum in the south and the cataclysmic danger in the north, finally declared that she had to face the Night King. She could not rule a kingdom of the dead. Tyrion cautioned that Cersei would use Daenerys' absence to fortify King's Landing, but Daenerys insisted that everything else was meaningless compared to stopping an undead army. She decided to sail north with a portion of her forces, including the dragons. Theon and Yara offered to help transport troops up the coast to White Harbor, from where they could march to Winterfell. Tyrion would remain in Dragonstone or possibly attempt to negotiate an armistice with Cersei. Theon privately wondered how any negotiation could succeed with Cersei, who loathed Daenerys and all her allies, but Tyrion insisted on trying. And so began a tense rush to gather men and resources for the battle to come. Theon was part of that. He oversaw the loading of troops onto Ironborn ships. The Dothraki were uneasy about the cold, but they boarded the vessels, chanting war songs. The Unsullied, disciplined as ever, marched in tight formation onto the decks. Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon, guiding Rhaegal and Viserion, while Theon directed Yara's captains. The old Theon might have exulted in the chaos and the opportunity to prove his mettle. The new Theon found himself praying silently that they were making the right choice, and that they were not sailing to their doom. The trip north was rougher, the seas darker and the wind sharper. Snow began to swirl in the air as they approached White Harbor. The sight of drifting ice floes unnerved many of the Associ soldiers. Yet Daenerys pressed on, stoic on the back of her dragon. When they finally made landfall, the welcome was cautious. Winterfell had prepared for the possibility of Targaryen allies, but the sight of dragons overhead rattled even the bravest hearts. Theon could see the dread in the faces of Northerners as he disembarked. They recognized him, some with open revulsion, for the man who once seized Winterfell. Daenerys, in her white furs, stepped forward with regal bearing, and Jon Snow and Sansa Stark came to greet her. Tormund Giantsbane and Brienne of Tarth flanked them, along with other northern lords. The tension was palpable. Sansa's cool gaze shifted to Theon, and he lowered his eyes. He managed to bow, his voice barely above a whisper as he greeted her. She did not speak, but she nodded, a tight gesture that might have been acknowledgement or simply an effort to remain civil. Soon, a council was held in the Great Hall of Winterfell. Daenerys, Jon, Sansa, and the Northern Lords. Theon, Yara, the Dothraki leaders, and the Unsullied commanders listened intently. Bran Stark was also there, distant and strange, speaking of visions of the Night King. Theon flinched upon seeing Bran, remembering the illusions he had tried to maintain when he claimed he had killed the Stark boys. Guilt welled up in him anew. The conversation turned to strategy. The White Walkers marched. Word came from the last hearth that it had fallen, the Umbers slaughtered. The dead were only days away. Daenerys promised to deploy the dragons, but the Northern Lords were uneasy. Dragonfire was terrifying, and the possibility of an undead dragon was even worse. Theon and Yara offered to guard the White Harbor, preventing any infiltration from the sea, though it seemed unlikely the dead would approach from that direction. In the frenetic days before the final battle, Theon found himself helping to erect barricades along the parapets. He hammered sharpened stakes into the ground, his breath steaming in the cold air. Northerners around him worked in grim silence, occasionally casting suspicious glances. They whispered that he was the Turncloak, the Kraken who once burned their homes. But some had heard that he'd helped Sansa escape Ramsay. Opinions were divided, but mostly they kept their distance. One night, Theon ventured into the Godswood. The old weirwood tree stood tall, its face carved with solemn eyes that wept red sap. He found Bran Stark there, sitting still as a statue. Theon hesitated, unsure if he was welcome. Bran turned his head slightly, eyes distant. He told Theon he remembered everything, the day Theon took Winterfell, how Theon had once pretended to kill him. But he also said he saw Theon's torment, the path he had walked since, the way he had rescued Sansa. Theon's throat felt tight. He sank to his knees and apologized, truly apologized, though he knew no words could undo what he had done. Bran's expression betrayed no emotion. He only said that the past was part of them, but it did not have to define their future. Theon left the Godswood with tears freezing on his cheeks. When the dead finally arrived, it was a nightmare given form. The night was black and cold, and a storm of ice and snow swept over the fields outside Winterfell. Theon stood atop the walls, crossbow in hand, along with the Ironborn and the Northern archers. Below, the Unsullied formed ranks, torches in hand. The Dothraki rode out to meet the initial wave, their aurochs lit by Melisandre's incantations. Daenerys circled overhead on Drogon, with Regal and Viserion flanking them, unleashing gouts of flame on the advancing whites. But the undead army was vast, stretching across the horizon. Bone and ice crunched underfoot as they swarmed. Theon's heart pounded. He shot bolt after bolt, each striking some twisted corpse or skeletal figure. Next to him, Yara roared defiance, hurling spears. If anything climbed the walls, the Ironborn hacked at them with axes. Yet for every undead creature they felled, two more seemed to take its place. In the sky, a terrible shriek tore through the clouds. The undead dragon emerged, the Night King astride its back, unleashing a storm of pale blue flame that froze and shattered the stones it touched. Daenerys shouted commands to her dragons, diving in to counter, but the clash in the air was savage and perilous. The swirling snow made it hard to see. Once, Drogon and the undead beast crashed together, tearing at each other with claws and teeth. Daenerys nearly fell from Drogon's back, clinging to the spines desperately. Below, in the courtyard, the Whites broke through the main gate. Theon and a group of Ironborn rushed down to reinforce. He found himself face to face with the undead once more, a shrieking horde of decaying bodies. He swung an axe, severing limbs, smashing skulls. The stench of death and the coppery tang of blood filled the air. He lost track of Yara in the chaos but prayed she was still alive. Time blurred. Everywhere soldiers fell. Theon's muscles burned. He realized he was near the Godswood, retreating step by step as the undead surged closer. He remembered that Bran was there. Panic lanced through him. He had to protect Bran. Spitting a curse, he gathered the remaining Ironborn and they formed a shield wall around the entrance to the Godswood. Inside, Bran sat beneath the weirwood, eyes rolled back as he warged into ravens overhead. Perhaps. Theon fought off wave after wave of Whites. At one point, he locked eyes with a White Walker, tall and silent, brandishing an icy blade. Fear seized him, but he refused to back down. He flung a spear of dragonglass, praying his aim would be true, and to his shock, the Walker shattered into shards of ice. Yet the onslaught continued. The ranks of the dead pressed forward. One by one, the Ironborn around him fell. Theon himself sustained a gash along his side, blood seeping into his leathers. He stumbled, breath ragged, but he kept fighting, fueled by a fierce determination. If he died here, he would die protecting the Starks, protecting Bran, one of the boys he had wronged. At last, as the Whites thinned, somewhere, someone must have struck a decisive blow, or perhaps a dragon had immolated a knot of them. Theon found himself alone near Bran, bodies of the undead littered around him. His arms shook, numb with exhaustion, but he forced himself to stand. Bran's eyes refocused. He looked at Theon and said, in a quiet tone that cut through the tumult, "Thank you." Outside the Godswood, another roar resounded, different this time. Suddenly, the Night King's undead dragon plummeted from the sky, bluish flames spewing erratically as it crashed into the far ramparts. Daenerys, on Drogon, soared overhead, battered and bloody, but triumphant. The final blow had been struck. The White Walkers were fracturing. Their whites began to collapse where they stood. A wave of relief passed over the battlefield. Theon slumped to his knees, tears streaming down his face in disbelief. They had survived. When dawn broke, Winterfell stood, though battered. Many lay dead. The courtyard was a charnel house of ice and gore. Daenerys landed Drogon and slid from the dragon's back, staggering with fatigue. Jon Snow, battered and bloodied, emerged from the castle's interior. Sansa, wide-eyed and trembling, oversaw the survivors. One by one, the living emerged, blinking at the pale sun in disbelief that they had survived the long night. Theon found Yara near the collapsed remnants of a wall. She was bruised, her arm in a sling, but alive. She embraced him, and he clung to her as though she were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. They had done what they came to do. They had helped defeat the undead, saved the realm from annihilation. Daenerys approached them, exhaustion lining her features. She placed a hand on Theon's shoulder, nodded at Yara, and said, "Thank you, both of you." In that moment, Theon felt something shift within him. He realized that for all the guilt he carried, he had finally begun to repay his debts. He had stood with the Starks, with Daenerys, and faced down the army of the dead. There was still more to do. Cersei Lannister remained in King's Landing, the Iron Throne unclaimed. But for the first time in what felt like ages, Theon felt a glimmer of worth, of belonging. He had found a queen who believed in the power of redemption, and he had made a stand that honored that belief. Over the coming days, as Winterfell mourned the dead and tended to the wounded, Daenerys and Jon spoke quietly about what would come next. They might unite the realm under Daenerys' rule, or they might find a compromise. Sansa was cautious, but her demeanor toward Daenerys thawed slightly after the Targaryen queen risked everything to save the North. In one scene that Theon observed from a distance, Daenerys stood on the snowy battlements, gazing over the fields where the pyres were being constructed. She looked regal and sorrowful. He joined her hesitantly, stepping through the snow with a limp from his wounds. She glanced at him, and he noticed the shadows beneath her eyes. They shared a few moments of silence. Then she told him that after all this death, she needed to find a way to build something lasting, something better than the wheel that had crushed the common folk for centuries. He nodded, replying that if she would lead, he would follow her as her husband in name, but also as an ally in truth. She allowed herself a small, weary smile. Thus began a new chapter in Westeros. The threat of the undead was shattered, at least for now, but the struggle for the Iron Throne remained. Theon Greyjoy, once a ward of Winterfell and a betrayer of the Starks, stood as consort to Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons and potential queen of the Seven Kingdoms. The uneasy alliance in the north waited to see what shape the future would take, whether peace could be forged or if war would reignite as they turned their sights south. Yet as the pyres were lit and the dead given their final rest, Theon felt a quiet sense of purpose. He had looked his demons in the face, had fought for something greater than himself. Whether or not the realm accepted him, he would stand by Daenerys' side, forging a path of redemption for House Greyjoy in the fires and storms yet to come.